Hey, what's up? It's Jake from Nimbus DevOps, and I'm going to be going over class and object namespaces. So after the class object was created, which I did in my previous video, which usually happens when the module is first imported, it basically represents a namespace. So we can call that class to create its instances. Each instance inherits the class attributes and methods and is given its own namespace. And now we already know that in order to walk in namespace, you have to do all you have to do is a dot operator, right? So let's look at this example. So let's say I make a class called person, and in here I just say species equals human. Species, geez, equals human. Okay, so let's look at this. What is it doing? Let's print person, and then we were talking about the namespace using the dot operator, right? So person dot species, and then you can also do person dot alive equals true, and we can add this dynamically as some sort of attribute, right? And I can actually print this as person dot alive, and that should evaluate to true. Let's say should be true. Uh, and we're just going to add this add dynamically. Okay, and this should return human because we defined that already in the class as some sort of attribute. So what if I say man is person? What does that mean? Okay, well, man is an instance of the person class. So man is a type of person, or one instance of a person. So let's check this out. Let's say print man.species. And notice that I was able to autocomplete this, and it knows that that is an option because man as an object is inheriting the attribute of the class that belongs to it. So man.species, and I could also print man.alive, which it's not finding because this is going to be executed at runtime. So it's not defined in here. If I had defined alive in here as true, let me do that actually. Let's say alive is true. Now, if I went in here and I typed alive, I can see that that is an attribute that is available as something to be populated. But we are going to populate this dynamically, add it dynamically. All right, so let's do like person dot alive equals false. If I were, if I were to print this then and say print man dot alive, uh, what what should happen? What do you think would happen? It's going to inherit this and be false. And I say man dot name, and let's do Darth, and man dot surname equals Vader, and then we'll say equals, you need a equals, and then we can print man dot name comma man dot surname, and you should get Darth Vader. So before I execute this, let's take a look. So we define a class attribute called species. So this is a species of the class person, or an attribute of the class person. Any name defined in the body of a class becomes an attribute that belongs to that class. So in the code, we've also defined person.alive, right? I did that here. It's another class attribute, but as you can see, there's no restriction on accessing that attribute from the class. And you can see man, which is an instance of person, inherits both of them and reflects that instantly when they change, such as saying it's false. Man also has two attributes that belong to its own namespace and therefore called instance attributes. And that would be your name and your surname. So these are attributes of the man namespace, And the man namespace is a namespace specific to man, which is an instance of the class person. Person has these attributes which man can inherit, but also man can have its own attributes. And since it's an attribute that belongs to man, this is an instance attribute, whereas this is a class attribute. So hopefully that makes sense. Class attributes are shared among all instances too. So uh, if I had made woman, and then in here, woman equals person. Woman is now also an instantiation or an instance of person, and the species attribute applies to both man and woman because they are calling it the same class. So you should use class attributes to provide states and behaviors to be shared by all instances, and then use instance attributes for data that will be specific to an object. And I could do the same thing with woman.name and say Jessica, and then woman.surname and say Jones. And this is specific to this instance. So this name Jessica and surname Jones, these are instance attributes that belong to woman, and they man has no knowledge of these attributes whatsoever. The same way that the name Darth and surname Vader are instance attributes of man, and woman has no knowledge of these instance attributes whatsoever. However, they both share the class attribute of human, and I could um, I could return I could print, for example, like woman dot species, and it would return human. The same way that I could print woman dot name comma woman dot surname. So hopefully that makes sense. Just talking about class and object namespaces. So woman has its own namespace with its own instance attributes. Man has its own namespace with its own instance attributes. They both share the same class attributes because they belong to the same class person, but they're all separate. Every instance of a class shares the same class attributes, but every instance of a class can also have its own attributes, which are isolated to this namespace. If you have any questions about that, let me know. Let that sink into your brain. Namespaces are super important, especially as you get away from this and start moving into things like Kubernetes and networking and things like that. So please let me know if you have questions. If not, then I will move on to attribute shadowing, and happy coding.